Supporters of an early Exodus view say that the 480 years of 1 Kings 6:1 is proof of an Exodus in the 15th century. Today, we look at that claim on this episode of Ancient Egypt and the Bible. Most scholars that still believe in a biblical Exodus hold to what is called a late-date view, circa 1260 BC. But some scholars still exist that hold to an early-date view, 1446 BC. Today, we discuss the main argument for that view. That argument states 1 Kings 6:1 gives an exact 480 years between the Exodus and the foundation of the temple of the Lord in Solomon's fourth regnal year. If you like these videos and wish to see more, please support us by hitting that subscribe button below. And if you wish to support this channel, please consider becoming a patron on Patreon or purchasing an advanced copy of my book that will be coming out in December. Please use the affiliate link below. So, let's begin with reading the text, 1 Kings 6:1. Now it came about in the 480th year after the sons of Israel came out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, which is the 2nd month, that he began to build the house of the Lord. The early date view begins with the foundation of Solomon's temple. Most scholars agree that the 4th year of Solomon was in 966-967 BC. And with the American Biblical Chronology assumption that all numbers need no context to interpret them, one only needs to add 479 to 967 BC to get 1446 BC, which happens to be the early date for the Exodus. And even though this may seem pretty solid, it doesn't hold well to much scrutiny. The argument is a little bit like the argument given by Oscar Diggs, better known as the Wizard of Oz. Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. Something is wrong, but you are only supposed to pay attention to what is in front of you. With the early date of the Exodus, you are only supposed to pay attention to the 480 years of 1 Kings 6:1, but ignore the many problems with this reading. And red herring after red herring will be thrown at you, so you pay no attention to the football team behind the curtain. As we examine each piece of evidence, I'm going to plot them on a chart so you can see each for yourself and decide for yourself at the end of the series if the early Exodus view makes sense. Here we have an empty chart with only a standard Egyptian chronology. Now I'm going to add 2 lines. One for the early Exodus date in teal, again circa 1446 BC, and one for the late Exodus date in purple, circa 1265 BC. The first man behind the curtain is the Ramses Problem. We've already mentioned this problem in the first video, but I think we need to flesh it out somewhat because it proves to be quite a problem for the general context of the Exodus, as spoken of by the Bible itself. By extending the date of the Exodus an additional 200 years, the Bible now conflicts with archaeology at several key points. Already, in the time of James Orr and J.W. Jack, Ramses in Exodus 1:11, 12:37, Numbers 33:3, and 33:5 were recognized as problems for a literal reading of 1 Kings 6:1. And it is a problem on two levels. On the first level is the name Ramses itself. The name appears no earlier than as the name of a general who later became the Egyptian king Ramses I, circa 1305 to 1303 BC. This is much too late for an early Exodus date. The other problem is the place Ramses of Numbers 33, 3, and 5. The city of Ramses did not exist prior to the reign of Seti I, circa 1303 BC. And this has been proven by cesium magnetometry and ground-penetrating radar surveys that have been done to the entire site of Khan Tir. So we could either read Ramses literally, or the 480th year literally, but not both literally at the same time. So how do early date supporters handle this problem? Well, they say that Exodus 1:11, Numbers 33:3 and 33:5 originally said Varus, and the text was later changed to Ramses by an editor. We call this redaction. How do they know this happened? Well, they don't. There is not a shred of evidence to suggest that this change was ever made. Unfortunately, these sorts of arbitrary changes don't end with Ramses. The same problem occurs with Pithom, also known as Etham, which was given that name by Ramses II when he built a temple to the god Atum there. Pithom literally means house of Atum. So the earlier dates change this and say basically, well, you're not supposed to read this as Pithom or Etham. You're supposed to read this as Cheku. What about Migdol, which was founded by Seti I, father of Ramses II? Now, we're going to update our chart here with the reign of King Ramses II and the terminus dates for the city of Peramses, the city of Ramses. And by the time the early daters are finished, they have not just suggested alternative interpretations of a single divine text. They have actually changed the words of dozens of texts. The next man behind the curtain is the Varus Problem. Varus was possibly the largest Semitic city of the ancient world. And because of its size, most views of the Exodus, late date and early date, agree that this was the city where the Israelites lived prior to the Exodus. And this is even affirmed by the fact that the city was so close in proximity to the city of Ramses, P-Ramses. The two cities of Varus and P-Ramses were about 2 kilometers apart. And while some have said that they are the same city, they really aren't. Ancient geography, that is, geography before the invention of the automobile, would have considered two towns 2 kilometers apart to be completely separate towns. Moreover, Varus was located on the south bank of the Pelusiac branch of the Nile, when the Nile wasn't flooded. On the other hand, P-Ramses was a city located on an island year-round. So both cities were always separated by water. Now, the problem with Varus is its archaeological context. The archaeology of the site shows constant occupation from around Dynasty 11 until early Dynasty 19, when most of the city was abandoned. Needless to say that if Varus was the city of the Israelites, having the majority of the city abandoned during Dynasty 19 instead of Dynasty 18, which is where the early date lies, this presents a problem. The next man behind the curtain, the Propinkuity Problem. From the Exodus narratives, we are supposed to get the impression that the Israelites, or at least the elders of Israel, lived in close proximity to Pharaoh. Pharaoh gives his orders directly to the taskmasters, and the taskmasters immediately set the Israelites to work. This closeness is called propinquity. A delay of weeks or months between message and delivery is not something worked into the text. We even see this during the night of the Passover. Pharaoh sends a message to Moses to leave Egypt, and it arrives at Moses' house that same night. The problem is that kings tend to live in the palaces of their capital cities. With the early Exodus view, which takes place in early Dynasty 18, the capital was located at Thebes in Upper Egypt, over 300 miles from the Asiatic city in Goshen of Varus. Moses' meetings with the Israelite elders living in Goshen of Varus and the king in Thebes would have been entirely impractical. Another man behind the curtain is the Joseph Problem. The chronology of Ramses and Varus is not the only problem. Again, the rules of interpretation used by American biblical chronology and the early Exodus view say that all dates are to be treated as chronological data. Exodus 12:40 reads that the sons of Israel lived in Egypt 430 years. So, the early date holds that not only the 480 years are literal, but also the 430 years of the Egyptian sojourn. And the two can be added together to get a date for Joseph. According to this, Joseph was elevated to the role of vizier in the years before 1876 BC. This date takes place during Dynasty 12 of Egypt's Middle Kingdom. I'm going to place a couple more lines on our chart to show the early dates view of Joseph's entry into Egypt with the late dates view using the same colors as before. Now, the problem is that in Genesis 41:43, we are told that Joseph rode a chariot alongside the king. And again, Joseph also rides his own chariot in Genesis 46:29. The problem is that the chariot is pretty well documented in Egypt, and was not introduced into Egypt until the Second Intermediate Period, 200 years later. The presence of the chariot in Genesis dates Joseph to no earlier than 1666 BC. Now, you might observe that the distance between the late Exodus date and the date for Joseph is less than 430 years. And there's a reason for this. And that is because the sojourn in Egypt wasn't 430 years. How do we know this? First, some of the variants of Exodus 12:40, like the Septuagint and the Samaritan Pentateuch, state that, quote, the sons of Israel lived in Egypt and Canaan for 430 years, end quote. So that's not just Egypt, it's also Canaan that's involved in that 430 years. This would suggest that the Masoretic text is not the original reading, and that the 430 years represents both the Israelites' combined time in Egypt and Canaan. But we don't need the Septuagint or the Samaritan Pentateuch to tell us this. The Masoretic text also reveals this to us. Genesis 46 tells us that 70 sons of Jacob came to Egypt, and 46:27 tells us that 3 of these were the sons of Levi, Gershom, Kohath, and Merari. Exodus 6:18-20 says that Kohath lived 133 years, and Amram, father of Moses, lived 137 years. If we add 133 to 137 and as much as 80 years for the age of Moses at the time of the Exodus, we know that their time in Egypt must have been less than 350 years. And even Paul in Galatians 3:17 says that 430 years took place between the promise to Abraham and the giving of the law. So even the New Testament confirms this reading. How did they miss this? Confirmation bias. This means that Joseph must have entered Egypt sometime around 1600 BC and after the introduction of the chariot. But again, given a choice between a simplistic reading of a number without a context and the biblical text, early daters choose the pretext every time. Well, that's all for today. We aren't quite done with the 480 years, because they have one more aspect of the theory we haven't addressed yet, which is the Egyptian king Amenhotep II as Pharaoh of the Exodus. Next time on Ancient Egypt and the Bible. Thank you for watching.